Earlier this summer, I got a call from my friend Marshall, inviting me to the eastern mountain ranges of California for a weekend trip to photograph ancient bristlecone pine trees. For a long time, I've had the bristlecones filed away in the back of my mind as an interesting subject to photograph someday. And Marshall's call was just the nudge I needed to finally lock in some dates and plan a trip. So I made my way to eastern California with a 4Runner full of cameras to meet up with my friend and fellow photographer, and we made our way to the higher elevations in search of old trees to point old cameras at. Being my first time in this location, I didn't know what to expect, but I was looking forward to shooting some film on a different sort of subject and seeing what I could come away with over the weekend. Considering I only had a couple days to work with, I think it did pretty okay.
So while we're out at camp, we noticed there were some clouds building up in the sky. So decided to run out here and start doing some scouting and see what we could see. Just the viewpoints of the White Mountains here, looking at the peaks. There's some dappled light coming through the clouds. It's really interesting. Looks promising from a photographic standpoint. So we're actually going to hike out here, these mountains in the background out here, and see if we can catch a viewpoint and get a shot lined up. Plenty of clouds up here. Hopefully it hangs out long enough to get something framed up. But I think it's black and white on this one, but we'll see when I find a shot. So I picked up a new toy for the 4x5, which is a Horseman 6x12 film back. Shoots 120 roll film. It's a nice 1x2 panoramic format. I think it works really well. Just happens to be a nice format for the scene behind me here that we're shooting. It's getting all this dappled light, looks really pretty. Fits as a black and white subject, so I'm shooting Delta 100 on this. And a 6x12 back gives me 6 shots for a roll of 120. So the light's been changing really fast as the clouds blow through. The dappled light keeps changing and rearranging a little bit. We get heavy clouds on the top of the composition that were kind of a distraction at first, but a lot of that's blown off now. So I've taken 2 exposures so far of my 6 for this roll. And I'll take a variety of exposures, probably experiment with another focal length too, and maybe use up the entire roll on this scene. Since 120 roll film's a little cheaper than 4x5 sheet film, I feel a little more able to experiment a little bit. It's not quite as much, not as much skin off my back, not as much money. The first 2 shots were shot at f32, ISO 100 is what I'm shooting, and that ended up being 1/15 was my shutter speed on those. I actually wanted to take a shot with the red filter. I have a red 25 filter with me, but I left it back at camp, so that's not going to happen. I think it works without it anyway. There's quite a bit of contrast between. There's probably about 4 stops of range between the shadows and the brightest parts of the cloud up here, so there'll be a little contrast anyway. I like Delta 100 because it's kind of a contrasty black and white negative film anyway. So I'm hoping that that'll kind of play to the strengths of the scene behind me. Marshall set up right next to me here with his Fuji GFX 100S? 100S.
All about megapixels.
Trying to rival me here in resolution a little bit.
No, I need the cropping space. Let's just be honest.
No, but it'll be interesting to see what he gets out of this. I'll have to bug him a little bit, show me a shot later on when he gets it developed. And we'll compare when I get the film back. But now I think it's time to experiment a little bit. I got the first 2 shots in the bag, so I'm a little not quite as, a little more relaxed now since I've got a couple shots under the belt. So now I feel like I can probably experiment a little bit. I'll probably change lenses and see if I can get something at a different focal length. I like the 1x2 panoramic crop, but that doesn't mean I have to shoot wide. I can still shoot with a medium or a longer focal length and get the appearance of that panoramic view. So that's what I'm going to experiment with now.
The first 2 exposures were taken at 150mm with my Nikkor W f5.6 lens. But I did take another set of exposures with my Fujinon 180mm. So here's all of them inverted. I actually ended up preferring the slightly wider frames at 150mm, and particularly the road in the foreground and the way that it leads up into the composition. And out of those 2 frames, the top left is the one I preferred the clouds in, and that's the one I worked on in post. So here's that final image, and let me know down in the comments what you think. So I have a color coding system with my sheet film holders for my 4x5 camera. Basically, it's an alphanumeric identifier with a different color for each kind of film, so E6, C41, and black and white. I talk about this a little bit in one of my videos from the Redwoods, which I'll link down in the description box below in case you haven't seen that.
So there's a shot that I'm trying to get on E6, so I'm shooting some Provia 100F, which is the green markers on my film holder. So just had to load some film real quick because, yeah, gotta do your chores. So I've set up my camera on a scene now that is something we scouted earlier. And it's a spot where one of these bristlecone pines, this one behind me here, has got a lot of streaks in the wood. I set up my camera shooting with the 300mm lens, and I filled the frame with just the streaks of that tree and all the grain of the wood. There's a couple knots that I've got in the frame that kind of add some interest, I think. And if this framing and this style of photograph seems familiar, because I did it in the redwoods on a big, massive coastal redwood tree. I just zoomed in on the bark on a shot of Velvia. I did this in Bryce on a ponderosa tree. Now I'm doing it here on a bristlecone pine. And that's intentional because I think that it kind of helps create, you know, a collection of photos that kind of go together and make sense a little bit. So that's what I'm working on here. And this one kind of follows suit with all of that. So it's just lots of detail, this beautiful tree. It really is a gorgeous tree. I think it's completely dead. I don't see any green or bark. There's some bark, but there's no greenery left on it. So I think it's probably dead. And it may have been dead for, some of these bristlecone pines are very, very old, you know. So that's interesting to me. They make for an interesting subject because of the shapes and stuff, but they're just ancient trees. I think it's incredible. I did have to overextend my bellows a little bit, trying to focus this close with the 300mm lens. And I'm shooting Provia 100F. So there's no worry about reciprocity failure or anything. My shutter time is 2 seconds at f45. But with the streaks of the wood, they kind of go on a vertical a little bit, but I wanted to, you know, add to that and really, you know, exaggerate that. So I ended up tilting the camera a little bit in order to get those streaks to run diagonally. But I think that helps with the framing and the placement of these knots and a few other features in the bark that kind of helps make it seem like a more pleasing, you know, composition. So I had to apply several different movements here. One, I'm on a little bit of an incline here, so I had to match the plane of focus with front tilt to try to get my plane of focus along the front of this tree. But then the tree's also got a general cylindrical shape to it, of course, you know, like most trees do. So there's a little bit of front swing to help kind of compensate for that, so they can kind of focus on this one area and match my plane of focus going that way. And then, of course, you have depth of field issues here, just because there's a couple knots, you know, and there's different depth, you know, of this wood grain here that I'm trying to capture and sharp. So that's why I stopped all the way down to f45. This lens goes to f90, so that's 2 stops away from the end of my aperture. So I'm not too worried about diffraction in this case. I'm sure there is some, but for my use case, what I'm doing here, I'm not too worried about it. So I exposed 2 sheets of Provia 100F on this one, and I think that's about all I want to do on this composition here. Kind of contemplated doing a black and white, but I don't think so. I've been shooting that all day, so I'm kind of thinking I'm going to stick with the E6 for now. Hopefully that fits in with the set real well. I'm thinking it will. Kind of matches the theme that I'm going for with some of these photographs that kind of go together. And I'll display those other images on screen too, so you know what I'm talking about. So this was a composition I was pretty excited about. I'm glad to have it in the bag, and I think it's time to wrap it up and kind of explore the rest of this hillside here. And there's a bunch of other bristlecones up here that would be really interesting to check out. We are getting some cloud activity now finally, so that makes these shots that kind of look up over the horizon a little more interesting. So we'll see if I can scout out something and take advantage of that.
Now I know that these super intimate shots aren't really everyone's thing, but for me, I was really, really pleased with this one. The exposure is spot on, and the detail is just amazing to look at on the light table. I'm really glad that I took the time and effort into capturing this photo, but of course I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. So here's the final image, as well as the other photos that I have so far in this collection. And as always, let me know your comments down below.
There is this dead bristlecone pine tree that's up on the ridgeline of one of these hills up here in the White Mountains that I have climbed up to set my camera up on. It's a tree that we scouted out yesterday. I actually shot 2 sheets on it yesterday, but I had, unfortunately, just dark blue skies, no cloud interest or anything. Now this afternoon, we do have some clouds, have some more cloud interest, so I'm back and I've set up on it again and I intend to shoot it again. But it's just this very, very super interesting shape of a bristlecone pine it's long past dead, and it may have been dead for a very long time. It's possible it's been dead for thousands of years, but I don't actually know on this one. But it's in an opportune spot that's looking straight up in the sky. It's got a little bit of dolomite rock around it, but it makes this circle shape in the middle. And that's what really attracted me to it, because it just looks like this, we called it the circle tree. But it's got these gnarly, awesome branches jetting off of it. Just super interesting to shoot. And I'm going for a black and white on this one, partly because it's broad daylight. It's getting direct sunlight right now. I'm also trying to use my linear polarizer to darken down the sky a little bit and kind of add some contrast to the clouds that are coming in. But probably one of the most important things to me on this composition was that where the ring formation is in the middle of this tree, there's a little bit of a ridge line with some dolomite rock in the background behind it. I didn't want that to cut through the center ring in an awkward way. So I've positioned my camera to where I'm looking up a little bit, using perspective to try to hide that behind the tree. Now I've been camped out on here for a minute, just waiting for these clouds that are kind of passing through in the sky to come up and come behind the composition so that it gives me some sky interest. They're kind of starting to come in now. Problem is these clouds go up over the ridge line of the mountains, and they kind of it's building its own clouds as the air currents come up over the mountains, and then they dissipate as they go over. So they're actually diminishing as they come into my composition. But I've got some pretty puffy looking sizable clouds on the way that are coming in. It's just gonna have to, it's gonna have to be a little bit of a waiting game, just waiting for them to get in the right position so I can take an exposure. But that time is coming very close, so I'm gonna start paying attention to this instead of that, so I can get this shot timed. So some clouds have come into the composition, just kind of in between 2 branches here. They kind of form this little pinchy looking shape, just landing right around here. So I went ahead and took one exposure. I'm shooting T-Max 100 on this black and white negative film. Sorry, I had to cut that short right there. There was a bird that came in and landed in the composition, so I went in and took another exposure. That was kind of cool. Just right on the very top, so that'll be interesting to see. Hopefully that was a meaningful distraction. But as I said, T-Max 100. I'm rating it at ISO 80 though, instead of 100, because the black and white film comparison that I just did, which I did a video on and I'll link to up here in the corner, showed me, or proved to me anyway, for my taste, that it looks like T-Max needs a little more exposure. It doesn't seem to act quite the same as the other ISO 100 black and white negative films, so I'm pushing the exposure a little bit more. And I'm using my linear polarizer, as I mentioned, to get a little bit darker blues in the sky and a little more punch in the clouds. And I had to add a stop and a third for that as compensation. Shooting this at 150 millimeters, f/37, and my shutter speed was 1/4. Next, I'm waiting for my clouds to kind of come in and continue coming into the composition here, and I may take another set of exposures playing with a red 25 filter. We'll see about that. In which case that adds an extra 2 stops, so that'll put my shutter speeds at 1 second. But I'm gonna sit here and wait for this to develop. There's a nice big chunky cloud coming in right now. Depending on what the placement looks like on that, I may or may not play with that filter. So yeah, so far 4 sheets of film on this composition, potentially another 1 or 2 here, we'll see. But in any case, here's those exposures, and let me know what you think down in the comments.
So here are the 2 exposures I took the night before. The frames turned out just fine, but if I invert the video, it's just that the sky has no interest in it at all. But by returning the next night and shooting it again, I was able to capture some cloud detail in there that made all the difference. The exposure on the right is the one with the bird, and I was really excited to see that I had captured him perfectly. I think the positioning of the clouds is much better in that one as well, so of course with all the elements combined, that was one of my picks from this batch. The one detail I hadn't noticed was that as the sun was setting behind me, a little bit of shadow had crept into the bottom left corner of my composition, although that wasn't too terribly hard to fix in post. Ultimately, I did end up taking a set of exposures with my red 25 filter. And at higher elevations, the sky already turns a really dark shade of blue. It's quite a bit different than what you might see at sea level. But that combined with the red 25 filter, as well as a linear polarizer to make the clouds stand out a little more, produced a really dark and dramatic looking sky, which I really like the look of. So I'll show you 2 finished images out of this one, and you can let me know down below which one you like the most. As the sun fell behind the mountains to the west, some high clouds treated us to a beautiful light show that evening, and we took the opportunity to shoot some digital frames. I took some longer telephoto shots, shooting directly through the last remaining rays of sunlight as they slowly retreated from the valley below for the night. One particular bristlecone pine tree set atop the crest of a hill with the earth shadow rising behind it.
We're on our last morning here in the White Mountains, and I've taken the Bronica kit out here for a walk, and we're just kind of shooting a little looser style here. Having fun with some shapes, some deadwood on. What I'm shooting right now is some deadwood that's down on the side of this slope here. Just got this really interesting texture to it where the weather has eroded this deadwood off, but there's this really beautiful orange texture with a little bit of like streaks and stuff in it. It just looks really beautiful. So I've set up the Bronica on to shoot some E100 on this one. The framing I've got going on right now is just kind of filling the frame with all of this wood waviness, which I think looks really good, but the problem is it gave me some issues trying to focus that close with my 150mm lens I have with the Bronica. So I'm experimenting with my extension tubes to try to get my plane of focus closer, or so that I can focus closer on my subject here. And yeah, I've had a hard lesson learned here. There's a certain order that these tubes go in, and I kind of screwed that up at first, so I wasted about half a roll, and they're all going to be completely overexposed because I didn't have them in the right order to stop the aperture down when it takes the exposure. So those all expose at full aperture at f3.5, so those will be ruined. But yeah, 12, 13 bucks a roll for film, that's pretty cheap to learn a lesson like that. So fortunately I caught it here in the field, so I shot all these again. So I've actually exposed an entire roll of E100 on this one subject. But we've had these clouds coming in and out, kind of blocking the sun, giving me a little bit of a headache here, trying to chase the changing light conditions all the time. So I keep having to change my exposure. So I haven't even bothered trying to record all my exposures on this one because they've just been changing all over. But it's kind of playing this game of trying to get the clouds in the right spots where you get, you know, I've shot some exposures that were on full shade. I've shot some that were in full sun with a little bit of, you know, shadow cast in this. And now it's about trying to see if I can time it to get the last exposures taken when it's just a little bit of soft light, but not completely blocked out by these heavy clouds. I don't know if I'm going to get that, but I'm going to hang out and see if I can maybe get it here with this last exposure. I'm on frame number 12, and I get 12 exposures on a roll with 6x6. So yeah, cool subject. Just a lot of cool stuff on the ground here. Don't have a lot of time left this morning here before I got a long drive home, but yeah, we're taking advantage of it best we can and see what I can come away with.
So there were no surprises on the first half of this roll. I knew on location that all of these were going to be completely blown out and unusable. It's just one of the hazards of playing with new equipment in the field. Fortunately, I had realized my mistake right there on the spot, so I was able to fix it and retake all of those exposures. And the second half of the roll turned out much, much better. If I remember correctly, I think it was frames 9 and 11 that ended up turning out the best. The exposure was good on them and they had the least amount of camera shake. It was after the fact that it occurred to me that this composition was the same fundamental concept as the previous image I had taken on the 4x5 on the side of that standing bristlecone pine. And I think that's okay. I often find myself shooting variants of a familiar composition. I think that's a good way to refine and practice. Ultimately, I much prefer the larger 4x5 transparency, but it was still a fun subject to explore. I also worked on a couple other compositions that were nearby with the Bronica, as well as one digital photograph. So here's all of those final images, and as always, let me know your thoughts. So that was it for the morning, and after taking the fun way down from the mountain, I hit the road for a long drive home. I feel pretty good about what I came away with from this trip, especially for only having a couple days, and it being my first time shooting the ancient bristlecones. As always, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you can let me know by hitting that thumbs up button down below. And if you want to see more from me, and keep up to date with what I'm up to, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button while you're down there. Special thanks to my Patreon patrons, and if you want to know how you can help support this channel and help me make more videos like this, make sure to check out those links in the description down below. Thanks again, take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you in the next adventure.